Hey everyone, good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And this week we are moving on with the Gospel of Mark in chapter 8. And so, as you can see, we don't spend more than maybe a week, or sometimes we get a couple of weeks in one gospel and then we move right along to something else. I understand with that can cause a little bit of frustration, but I'm actually grateful that we're doing it this way because it allows us to appreciate how each of these gospel writers are taking these stories that are somewhat modularized in the way that they are utilized by these gospel writers, um, and moved around a little bit in the sequence, not always. Sometimes the stories that precede the one we might be looking at is the same story that precedes the current passage we're reading in another gospel. Say, in this case, we're looking at Mark. It may be Matthew and or Luke that utilize the same structure, but then they are including other stories before or after it that are not included by their synoptic counterparts. And with that, we get a clearer appreciation of the fact that the Holy Spirit were guiding these men to use these stories in the fashion that they were for the sake of illustrating the agenda that they wanted their readers to understand about Jesus and the way they stylized his life, using the real life historical incidents that occurred in the moments of Jesus's teaching and his miracles and the interactions with day-to-day people. And so with that, it's important for us to appreciate that a story like this that is common to all the Gospels, or at least the version of the feeding of the 5,000, which is a part of this Gospel we're actually going to backtrack into, contained for us in Mark chapter 6. And we're going to be moving forward way later into the Gospel of Mark to see how this is connected toward the end of Mark's story, but I'll save that for later. But as we're doing that, we're appreciating the fact that this story is of paramount importance, but it's not really told to us why by any of the gospel writers, including John, who presumably is writing after the first three evangelists that have recorded this, or at least the story of the feeding of the 5,000, because I don't believe John actually includes the feeding of the 4, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. That being said, the very intimate nature of these two stories, the feeding of the 5 and then the 4,000, are intertwined in such a way they are not separable, even though they might be separated or distanced from each other by a few other stories, but they are very intimately intertwined and linked with one another. That being said, if we refer back to the feeding of the 5,000 and consider that it's present in all 5 Gospels, we must certainly scratch our heads and wonder why the Spirit wanted that story amongst all other stories included by all 4 gospel writers. So we're going to try to capture something of that today without really having to parallel these stories by any of the other gospel writers that include them. Instead, keeping them where they are in Mark. Now, time is not going to be made available to us to really consider how Mark is using this story and why. Instead, I'm going to shift gears and appreciate instead how all of these gospel writers would be utilizing this story as it connects to the Old Testament. So that's the reason why I'm not paralleling it with the way the other gospel writers are using this story and how it would compare to their particular agenda and show a more harmonized approach at all 4 of those themes operating in every one of those gospels. So that being said, let's read these 10 verses and then we'll dive in. So Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. In those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. Oh, excuse me. He called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them will have come a long distance. And his disciples answered him, almost as if they seemingly had forgotten the original moment where Jesus fed the 5,000. So where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? How many loaves do you have? He asked. 7, they said. He commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and after he blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. So they ate and were satisfied. Then they collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces, and about 4,000 were there. He dismissed them, and he immediately got into the boat with his disciples, and he went to the district of Dalmanutha. If you will, let's pray. Jesus, our King, Lord, you are so merciful, so good, so benevolent. There really are no words in the tongues of men, or even of angels, if there are such languages, that describe how wonderful and magnificent you are. The universe cannot contain your glory. And in the beauty of what we see above our heads, in the brilliance of the blue sky and the shining of the sun, the ambiance of the moon and the stars at night, and even with the ability of devices that assist our own senses in being able to peer into the depths of the cosmos, yet all of the beauty that is searchable there is but the fringes, just the parts of your robe that seemingly sweep against the dust of the ground that you walk on. To try to wrap our minds around such a thing is impossible. You are exalted above all. You are the Lamb who was slain, and yet you rule victoriously. You have conquered death, hell, and the grave. And we will forevermore praise you. Thank you for this time that we have. Lord, a story like this is familiar to many of us. To some of us, it may not be. I pray, Lord, that you would open our minds and gift us with a deeper understanding. Help us to connect parts of this story to other parts of Scripture that were inspiring this author, along with the others, where we find these accounts preserved for us, to appreciate what exactly was going on here and what you were hoping to help your disciples understand about who you were and what you came to do and the role that you were filling, and the gravity of the times that you were living in as you walk this earth, and the implications that meant for your followers and what it means for us even today. So, Lord, I pray that you would challenge our faith and help us as we are challenged to rise to the occasion, to step into the framework of what you have destined us for, so that we will be obedient servants, surrendering our autonomy, choosing to be obedient to you in all things. May you receive the glory in all of this, and we ask it in your name. Amen. So, title for this, perhaps rather rudimentary, would be Loaves and Fishes. I want us to see, though, that there is a feast here, and in all of it, really a commissioning, but that hopefully will make sense more toward the end. I hope I don't forget what my title is, because sometimes I think when I get to the end of it, and then I teach it again the next day in Sunday school, I realize I didn't actually touch on that the way I had intended to. Maybe it didn't quite make sense the way I wanted it to, and so with that, maybe I'm selling short sometimes. But hopefully I give you enough puzzle pieces that if you're contemplating and meditating, that maybe you're able to put it together in spite of my madness. But I would have us refer back to Isaiah 25 first, and I just want to read these verses. Although it may not seem like it connects in a direct sense, it does in an indirect sense, and it's going to require me to build some context for you, so I will work to try to explain it. But in the beginning of this oracle, Isaiah says, "Lord, you are my God, and I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have accomplished wonders, plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. For you have turned the city into a pile of rocks, a fortified city into ruins. The fortress of barbarians is no longer a city, and it will never be rebuilt. Therefore, a strong people will honor you. The cities of violent nations will fear you, for you have been a stronghold for the poor person, a stronghold for the needy in his distress, a refuge from storms and a shade from heat. When the breath of the violent is like a storm against a wall, like heat in a dry land, you will subdue the uproar of barbarians. As the shade of a cloud cools the heat of the day, so he will silence the song of the violent." So clearly, with words and phrases here, such as a fortified city being brought to ruins and a fortress of barbarians no longer being a city to never be rebuilt, cities of violent nations fearing you, and then, of course, there being storms and heat and breath of the violent storm, against a wall, heat in a dry land. And then, of course, with all of those negative terms, we are counterbalancing that with all of the hopeful phrases and words. I guess I should also consider the idea of the city being turned into a pile of rocks. Actually, no, that's not a negative term. That's a positive one. Forgive me. I caught that with my eye, and I thought I missed something, but I didn't. The idea of God turning the city into a pile of rocks, that's judgmental. This is actually positive, though, because what is going on here in this particular sequence of Isaiah's oracles is that we've moved away from the more regional idea of judgment, as goes the kingdoms of God's people, that being the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and all the kingdoms that surround them, and the pronouncement of oracles of judgment against all of those kingdoms, and ultimately leaving God as the sole victor over all of them, and of course the help that his people should be relying on. This coming at a time when these peoples are looking for opportunities to strike treaties with other kingdoms around them so that they can hedge their bets and fortify themselves against the looming threat of Assyria against them. That God is pronouncing the fall and doom of all of these kingdoms, not because he wants to knock them out of the way for some spiteful reason, but because every one of those kingdoms are guilty, of course, of their crimes and transgression against God. But that being said, they will all seem to fall. And with that, God is the one person, the one entity, the one party left who should be the only one they were ever looking to be their helper. And so with that, when he calls us the fortified city, but notice here, he's not referring to this fortified city by an actual proper name. And so what happens is that moving beyond the regional judgment, it seems to take on more of a cosmic nature. And by cosmic, I know when I say that word, oftentimes our minds might be cast to the stars to think about everything that exists beyond planet Earth. But that's not the way the cosmos was seen in the mind of the ancients. The cosmos and the terrarium or terrestrial realm that we live on are all connected. It's all touching one another, and so it's all part of the same existence. Granted, there are distinctions between them, a firmament that separates the sun, moon, and stars away from what lives and dwells here on Earth. But that being said, it's all seen together, with the Earth being part of the cosmos. So we need to understand from the ancient perspective, that's exactly what's in mind and in the frame of reference. So when I use that word, that's what I'm referring to. So it takes on more of a cosmic sense in the idea that all of these kingdoms that are typologically represented by the kingdoms that surround Israel and Judah, and even reaching as far out across the Mesopotamian river valley as goes Assyria, and saying all of these kingdoms that are filled with violence and barbarians that vaunt themselves in their pride against God, and because of their wickedness and transgressions, they will all fall. God is going to take from the ash heap of humanity. We need to make sure that Israel and Judah are not left out of this. They are also castigated because of their sins, and they too will be destroyed. But all of this will be rebuilt into a new city, of which and in which a new humanity will occupy and begin to flourish. But it will be a remnant of all humanity, not just the covenant people of God in the sense of the ethnic descendants of Abraham through Jacob. So with that, we have this idea of God preserving humanity and building them anew. So there's wreckage and ruin because of the way that people have violently treated one another and violently treated God's people. But God's people have even violently treated each other in this way, such that they have acted like the nations and have consigned themselves to doom as well. And from it all, God is going to do something salvific here to turn the city, the fortified city that's, again, vaunted itself against God in pride, into rubble, and he will build a new city in which a strong people will honor him. And God will become, because he has been, the stronghold for the poor person, the one who is seemingly oppressed and kept down or downtrodden over by these barbaristic city-state kingdoms who have oppressed everyone around them. And again, the poor are almost always a picture of those whom God is using as a clear symbol of those who he intends to exalt, while he is also simultaneously debasing those who consider themselves to be powerful and above the reach of mere humans. That he will continue to be a stronghold for the needy in his day of distress, a refuge, a shade from the heat, and of course, he will subdue the roar of barbarians. So with that, we go over here to Mark chapter 6. And in the beginning of this chapter, long before we ever actually get to the part of the sequence where Jesus is feeding the 5,000, starting off with the story, I'm not going to read all of this because if I do, it's just going to take too much time. I'm going to instead summarize it so that you understand what's going on in each of these different sequences. But in Luke chapter 4, many weeks ago, when we were reading about that particular moment where Jesus was in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, and he was reading from the Isaiah scroll, providing commentary and prophetic assurance that those eschatological words were now coming to pass. Mark is giving us a very brief rendering of it. He doesn't include any information at all about the preaching of the sermon or the content, but instead he does give us the reaction. So we know that Jesus comes to his hometown, and when Sabbath came, he is teaching in the synagogue, and then we get the response of the people, and they're asking, isn't this Joseph's son, the son of the carpenter? We know his family. He can't possibly be the one who is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And so as they were offended by him, Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. And the response of that is he's not seemingly able to do many miracles because of their disbelief. But we pair this up with Luke chapter 4, and we see that there was a measure of barbarism here. Now, it's hard for us to work out the sequencing of all the details here because in Luke chapter 4, it seems like there was an immediate response. They want to take Jesus out of the synagogue, go to the edge of the city, throw him off the cliff. Somewhere in the midst of all that, Jesus is able to make this statement that a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. Maybe he said that when he was in the synagogue, maybe on the way to the precipice of the cliff, maybe at the edge of the cliff. Doesn't really matter. The point being is that putting the story together more forensically gives us this three-dimensional picture of what was really going on there. We understand there is a violent reaction here, which takes us back over to Isaiah 25, the violence of the nations. But remember, Isaiah's picture also paints the people, the ethnic descendants of Abraham through Jacob, the people of Israel, as being as barbaristic as the nations because of their violent actions against one another, in spite of the revelation that God has made to them. And because of that, in chapters 7 all the way through, 13 all the way up through 23, we have the kingdoms of Judah and Israel being included amongst those kingdoms that are being judged because of their violence. Then we move on a little further down in the story, and we will see on the other side of Jesus commissioning the 12 disciples, another moment of violence here where King Herod, and it's not the same King Herod, obviously, that wanted to hunt down Jesus when he was but an infant or toddler. Instead, this is the son that replaces Herod the Great's immediate heir. This is not Archelaus, rather it's Herod Antipas. And at this point, he has already imprisoned John the Baptist and beheaded him. And so when the fame of Jesus begins to rise to a point of notoriety where Herod is now hearing about it, others are telling him that he is John the Baptist, raised from the dead. And of course, that haunts him because he said, John is the one that I beheaded. And apparently he has been raised, or so he is willing to entertain that idea for a while. Then Mark gives us several more verses to help us understand the circumstance by how John came to be in Herod's custody. And then while he was held in detention there, eventually it led to his own beheading because of that moment where Herod wanted to see his stepdaughter dance for him and then was willing to offer half of his kingdom. And in the process, a bargain was struck between Herod's wife and his stepdaughter that John's head would be the price for Salome dancing before Herod Antipas. So a measure of violence and barbarism where John the Baptist, a representative of the righteous remnant, is now being persecuted by yet again another tyrannical king. It's a story for the ages, as goes the concourse of biblical narrative from the beginning of the story in Genesis all the way up to this moment. How many times have we seen something like this? And this, too, is the very thing that's built into what Isaiah is speaking about here with respect to the violence of the nations. And again, I say, their barbaristic actions. So we're seeing this juxtaposed against the opening verses of Isaiah 25 with respect to the fact of life as it is in Isaiah's day, and with that, the promise of what God is going to be doing as a means of answering this, destroying all of these nations that act this way, and then raising from it a new humanity and a new city in which these people will live, and God will dwell with them in it. So we move on to the next portion of Isaiah 25, verse 6, where we see how God is going to answer this problem as he is destroying the violent nations who act this way, and now bringing the remnant of all that is left of humanity together, where it is said that on this mountain, and this mountain, of course, is Jerusalem, but we need to understand in the idea of what Isaiah is saying here, it's taking on more of a cosmic concept, which again, when I say cosmic, I mean heaven and earth united in this sense, as one is the extension of the other. And so if we appreciate that a little better, and we understand it's not meant to be seen necessarily as only the mountaintop of Jerusalem in and of itself, because how in the world could that mountain hold the remnant of all the nations who are going to be gathered in to worship God? The idea is that it's somehow grown to become a mountain big enough to hold that, but that mountain in a sense is filling the earth. And so it in a way kind of takes on the connotation of Jerusalem has now covered the face of the earth, that such that all the land of the earth is now the cosmic point of Mount Zion or Jerusalem. So on this mountain, the Lord of armies will prepare for all the peoples. This phrase is always and exclusively meant to be taken as a reference to the nations. That does not exclude Israel, as goes the idea of the ethnic descendants of Abraham through Jacob included in this, but the nations are unmistakably a part of this. A feast of choice meat, a feast of aged wine, prime cuts of choice meat, fine vintage wine. So we have wine, we have meat. One could presume in the way that we consider the idea of fellowship offerings being given to the Lord, that all of it together is seen not just as a meat sacrifice, but also the gathering and bringing of wine, oil, and bread, and all of this used and offered on the altar as a portion to God. A portion is given to his representative in this sacred space, that being the priest and Levites. And then a portion is also given to the worshiper, and depending on the animal and how much meat is available, a picnic could even be made, or a feast of sorts for all those that are invited as part of this particular Thanksgiving or fellowship offering. So if that's the case here, then if that language from Leviticus is being invited into this, then we can presume, though it's not said, that perhaps bread, and most likely bread, would be a part of this. But moving on, the more important aspect is that the culmination of this feast is that on this mountain, the Lord will swallow up the shroud, the burial shroud that covers all the peoples. So the thing that affects all the nations, right? Very, in fact, it says that to complete the sentence. The sheet covering all the nations. When he has swallowed up death once for all, the Lord will wipe away the tears from every face and remove his people's disgrace from the whole earth. So now his people has become the nations, because they are disgraced by the presence of death and exile away from God. But God is removing that shroud and that separation that keeps them divided from him and one another. And by virtue of that, they will become united together and with him. For the Lord has spoken, on that day, it will be said, these people, not just the ethnic descendants of Israel, but the remnants of humanity gathered together as the new Israel. Look, this is our God. We have waited for him. He has saved us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. So let's rejoice and be glad in his salvation, for the Lord's power will rest on this mountain. So we go back to Mark 6. And in the story that separates Jesus's rejection in Nazareth, and then the report of John the Baptist being beheaded by virtue of Herod recognizing that Jesus apparently is more powerful than John, and the reports around the area is that John the Baptist has been resurrected. Herod has yet to discern this for himself as to whether or not Jesus is indeed a separate person or what they say is true. But with that, we have a gap-filling sequence that shows us the barbarism of a tyrannical king that's been working against God's people, which is representative of what the nations are always scheming to do. And in between those sequences, we have this moment where after Jesus's rejection, the rejection of Messiah, the estimation has to be that Israel doesn't want their Messiah. And so therefore, because Israel was rejecting the plan, the agenda of God, moving forward, a new Israel or a renewed Israel from within the old, pulling out the remnant of the faithful who are willing to follow Messiah. And as Isaiah had predicted centuries before, the rest of the ethnic descendants of Jacob that want nothing to do with Messiah in God's plan because they think he is going to do something different. They think they've reasoned out in their minds how God is going to answer and solve the dilemma of Messiah coming and drawing Israel up to the summit of that mountain and seeing them as Lord over all the nations and the nations subservient to them. You know, they've got this whole mechanism in place of how Messiah is going to be a conquering militaristic hero of sorts, and the nations will experience severe judgment and all of that stuff. But instead, Messiah has a totally different plan that Isaiah has already outlined for them, and he is stepping into that, and now they have the choice. They must decide. They must decide. Are they going to follow or are they going to reject? Well, for those who will follow, they get to become a part of this new Israel that is now spearheaded by the 12 that are called out from amongst Jesus's disciples who have been following from him from the beginning of his ministry. And he is now going to send them out as a series of teams, 2 by 2, to infiltrate Israel and spread the good news of the kingdom and compel people to repent, to believe this good news, to verify it with the signs of the power of God working upon them so that they can clearly see the evidences of the fact that God's kingdom has come amongst them and everyone is invited to come in. So with that being said, that makes all the more sense as to why exactly they were sent only to the lost sheep of Israel to start with, because Israel is going to have the first pass at being able to experience this so that as a renewed Israel, they can fulfill their destiny in going to the nations once Jesus leaves them behind to fulfill this mission he leaves them with, so that now all the people will have a chance to come to the cosmic mountain of God, where the burial shroud that has embarrassed all the nations has been removed, and God is wiping away the tears that cloud their eyes, instead trading that shame for joy as he gives them life everlasting and welcomes them to his table where they experience his feast. So then we move on through the rest of Mark chapter 6, and what happens after this but Jesus then feeding the 5,000. So I don't need to go into all of that sequence. We already know exactly what happens here. But one thing I will say is that Jesus looks to them and he has compassion on them. So that is something that connects this story with what we actually are reading in Mark chapter 8, where again, he says, as he looks at them, I have compassion on the people. So Mark is purposefully using that phrase to make sure that we understand these stories are clearly hyperlinked with each other. And also, it's meant to take us back, as I said last week, with respect to the concept of Moses praying for a shepherd and God having compassion on his people and not letting them be scattered like sheep without a shepherd, and instead appoint someone over them who will look out for them, go out before them, come in behind them, and God grants them that with a new leader in the form of Yeshua. And now a different but better, a newer Yeshua has come on the scene to be that shepherd who is going to lead them. So with that, he encourages his disciples to try to solve this dilemma, and they don't know what to do. So there's teaching points with respect to that, and that's a separate lesson in and of itself. But all that to say, as the eaches are worked out here and they're not sure what to do, Jesus is going to instruct, tells the disciples to arrange them in companies, sit them all down, and then they have pulled out some food here from amongst the crowd. A small little lad has some loaves and fishes, and we have a total of 5 and 2. Jesus then looks up to the heavens. He breaks them, he blesses them, and then he breaks them. Then he begins to pass them out, and then there are 12 baskets full left over. So summarizing that story for the sake of being able to move on and finishing out Mark 6, after that happens, what do we see here? But Jesus now separating himself from his disciples, and he is going to pray for a time while yeah, while he has sent them off and they have gotten into a boat, they are rowing to the other side of the lake, which is going from Capernaum on the west side in the territory of the Galilee area that is primarily Jewish, over to the area of Gennesaret, that is part of the Decapolis and is primarily Gentile in nature. So, of course, the storm comes on the sea. They're afraid. Jesus comes walking to them on the water. He gets in the boat and he immediately calms the storm. The winds and waves die down. And when that happens, it's interesting. It's so interesting that Mark makes this statement that they were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. It's amazing. He's the only writer that makes it a point to say anything here about the fact that their amazement and astonishment had anything to do with the fact that the miracle they had just seen with Jesus feeding the 5,000 had not yet sunk in for them. They had not put the puzzle pieces together. And by virtue of that, as he says here, their hearts were hardened. Now, we're going to come to that later on at the end of our lesson. I just wanted to draw attention to it now. As we finally round out chapter 6, we go to Gennesaret. And there, of course, in other gospel sequences, we see Jesus. Apparently, if these stories all match up with each other, he is healing people as many are bringing the sick to him. At some point in all of this, it would seem that Jesus also went to cast out the demons from the demoniac man or men possessed with legion, and then after that gets back on the boat and goes back to the other side, where he'll take up the opportunity to see other people and perform more miracles and teach yet again. But we have Jesus going to the regions of the Gentiles, and he's casting out demons. He's healing the sick, such that people are carrying their mats to wherever he was. And people are just trying to touch the edge of his garments, and everyone that Jesus encounters is being made whole. So what do we have here but a renewed Israel that stems from the very fact that the Israel of old has rejected their Messiah, and being called out of that is a remnant of the faithful, those who are willing to decide or and follow as they are compelled by the evidences of what they hear and see. And by virtue of that, this new Israel is leaving the old behind so that they can fall on the ash heap of what is left of all the nations as the kingdom of God continues to grow and flourish, building from the ash heap of all the kingdoms that he is going to destroy or bring to naught, as goes their level of significance in building his kingdom. And the nations will have to decide whether they want to be a part of it or forever excluded from it. And so as they are, they will be invited to this feast. And this new Israel, with Messiah at the helm here, is going to cross over the water, just like the Israel of old, crossing through the water of the Red Sea to become a new humanity, entering into a new creation that God is making for them, when he's going to take them into Canaan, where he will dwell with them so that they can be a blessing to all the nations. This Israel, following Messiah, is crossing the water to do this very thing, to directly impact the nations so that they can see the power and presence of God in their midst and know that his kingdom has also come to bring them in as well. It's a lot going on in this chapter, and we haven't even got to Mark 8 yet. We're bypassing Mark 7, though, so just rest assured we're going to make up some time here. So you might be wondering how this all connects so far to Isaiah 25. Well, let's get through Mark 8 first, and we'll try to link that together. So at the beginning of this chapter, in those days, there's yet again another large crowd, nothing to eat. And Jesus says, I have compassion on the crowd because they've stayed with me 3 days. Man, I want to highlight this and circle it in red. And they have nothing to eat. Why circle it in red or draw attention to it? This formula is scattered all throughout the Old Testament. One of the first mentions of it comes to us from Genesis 22, where after 3 days of walking, Abraham is shown the place where he's supposed to take Isaac and offer him. And so he tells the servants to stay there. The boy and I will go worship. We will come back to you. He lays the elements of sacrifice on the sacrifice, Isaac, to walk with these things up the mountain of Moriah or Jerusalem, the very cosmic point where heaven and earth meet together, right? For the sake of this offering being offered. But remember what I've told you before with respect to this formula of 3 days or on the third day. In almost every instance, it's used throughout Scripture, which builds all the more toward the crescendo of its use in the crucifixion story of Jesus and his subsequent resurrection. And that's the idea of there being some element of exile attached to it and an Exodus-like moment on the other end. And so even though they might be scaled down into just a few people involved in this, but you consider the idea of Isaac being consigned to death, which is an exile, of course, but he is receiving the Exodus through a resurrection-like event on the opposite side of that, where he is spared and a substitute is provided in his place. Or, of course, the next mention of this is here with Moses and Aaron going to confront Pharaoh in his palace. And when they go to him and say, the God of Israel says, let my people go because they are in exile, and he has come to lead them out through an exodus so that they may go out into the wilderness and hold a festival for me. Of course, we have Pharaoh balking at this, but then Moses answering, the God of the Hebrews has met with us, and he says, please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to our God, in a sense mimicking what happened with Abraham and Isaac on Moriah. And the idea is that this is a 3-day trip out into the wilderness, ending their exile, so that through this exodus they may gather unto God, and by virtue of that, offer up those Thanksgiving offerings that reach back to the moment where Isaac was being offered by Abraham, symbolizing the end of exile and the bringing about of Exodus. So the pictures continue to abound. But notice this, when we go back to Isaiah 25 and what we just read a second ago, that the themes of exile and Exodus are prevalent toward the crescendo moment of this particular song of praise, because they say, look, this is our God. We've waited for him and he has saved us. As you've heard me say before, salvation in the Old Testament is always being defined by the picture of what's being given to us in Exodus 15, the song by the sea, the crossing of the Red Sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army, and the salvation of God's people, the release of them from their captivity so that they can become a new humanity for the sake of releasing blessing from the Lord for all the nations. And it's funny because the song is being sung on a mountain in Isaiah 25, and it's Moses saying that God is going to plant his people on a mountain where his sanctuary will be ordered and dwell with him forever. And they end this song by saying, let's rejoice and be glad in his salvation, because the Lord's power will rest on his mountain. So here we go back to Mark 8. And granted, these people have literally been with Jesus for 3 days. I don't think there's any embellishment or exaggeration of that at all. But the point is that Mark is choosing to use that detail. He doesn't have to give us a number at all to try to build for us in our minds how long they've been walking with Jesus. Now, sure, it may help to understand that if they've been without food for this time period, that if there's a great distance to cover to get back to a place where there's open markets for them to buy food, they might actually grow faint and collapse along the way. But this too feeds into what Isaiah was saying, because Isaiah said the new Exodus that would come would be seen in the vein of the old, where God brought food from heaven and water from rocks to feed his people. They will not grow weary. They will not faint along the way. So Jesus is going to provide them sustenance before he dismisses them to go back to their homes. And the use of the 3-day imagery here is for the sake of helping us understand that he is the servant who is coming to inaugurate the last and greatest of the Exodus movements as he ends the exile for all humanity, seen in Isaiah 25 as a shroud that covers everyone, the burial shroud that disgraces all humanity with the certainty of death. So now we go back to Mark 6 for a second, but we're going to parallel this against some other aspects of Mark's gospel. But before I do, let me make sure I've made this clear in case I haven't, or you haven't quite put it together yet, that what's going on in the instance of Mark 6 and Mark 8 with the feeding of 5,000 and 4,000 is the invitation to come to the feast. And as I said before from Isaiah 25, it's emphatically clear this is an invitation for the nations to join with the remnant of Israel who is going to follow Messiah and be a part of this kingdom God is bringing humanity into if they so choose. And we see that very clearly in the idea of 5,000 being fed on the western side of the Sea of Galilee around the area of Capernaum. And with that, it's a primarily Jewish area. And of course, there's 12 baskets of leftovers being taken up, fully symbolic of the number of the nation itself with respect to the amount of tribes that the nation consists of. And then on the eastern side, in the area of the Decapolis, where the population is primarily Gentile in nature, it's 7 baskets and 4,000 being fed. And the numerology can go on here for days, but suffice it to say, it's the number 7, which is complete in and of itself. And with that, it's an invitation to the Gentiles as a measure of completeness to bring them into the kingdom such that they are not excluded. All right, so the feast has come. It's been inaugurated. We're not waiting for that to come in the future, such that there's supposed to be a moment yet still to come in which we're all going to be sitting around at a table enjoying a feast in Jerusalem. I'm not saying it can happen, but what I'm saying is the story as it's been written so far, it seems to suggest it's already happened. It doesn't have to be seen in the specificity of the exact detail and taken in a hyperliteral sense, as many of these things that Isaiah talks about are given to us with hyperbolic, poetic, symbolic language, such that we have the freedom of the actual story itself being seen in Jesus taking just loaves and fishes, but creating a feast to the point where these people are beyond satiated. They are busting. They are so full, and there is yet a magnanimous amount of food left to be taken up and preserved. All right, so let's go back to Mark 6 for a second. Feast of the 5,000. 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and Jesus looking up to heaven and blessing them. He blesses, and then he breaks the loaves, and then he gives them to his disciples. We go to Mark 8. Same thing. Takes the 7 loaves. He gave thanks, broke them, gave them to his disciples. It's interesting when we get to Mark 14, and this is the part of Mark's gospel where we have Jesus in the upper room with his disciples. And he's celebrating this Passover Seder with his disciples, what we will call the Lord's Supper. In almost the exact same sequence, on almost the exact same words verbatim, we have the disciples eating, but then Jesus taking bread, blessing it, breaking it, and then giving it to them. Well, what does he say about this? So, put together the idea of it in your mind. They've seen and been a part of this before. Maybe they weren't thinking it at the moment. It doesn't really matter if they were. That's rather irrelevant, actually. But what is important is for the readers to be able to capture the hyperlinks of previously in Mark 6, feeding of the 5,000, Jesus blessing bread, breaking it, giving it to his disciples. Mark 8, feeding of the 4,000, Jesus blessing bread, breaking it, giving it to his disciples. Mark 14, up in the upper room, Jesus blessing bread, breaking it, giving it to his disciples. But now he's going to say, take, eat this. This is my body. Now, I include for you here from Luke 22 that where Jesus actually gave thanks, and I'm only doing this as a way of just simply saying that here in Mark 6, we have him blessing it. In Mark 14, we have the use of the same term, blessing it. But in Mark 8, we have him giving thanks for the bread. And you might say, well, that may be a little different. In reality, of course, it's not. But just to make sure we understand it, that in Luke 22, it's the same thing. He gave thanks while he's up there in the upper room with them. So clearly we understand that the hyperlinks abound and are meant to connect these stories together for us. And then, of course, in Mark 14, as we continue on after this moment where he's blessed, broke, gave it to them, and said, this is my body. He then will take the cup, do the same with it, pass it to them. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. Now, the significance, I think, of this would be seen in how this will carry through Isaiah 53, where he is the substitutionary sacrificial atoning, substitutionarily atoning sacrifice that is meant to be seen as the one of Isaiah 53, bearing our sicknesses, carrying our pains, struck down by God and afflicted, and pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities, punished so that we may have peace with God, be healed by his wounds, and we who are like sheep. Notice the imagery there, because what do we see going on in the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000? That Jesus, having compassion, he looks on them as sheep who are without a shepherd, and he has taken on himself the weariness of their own travail and rebellion against God, because they have rebelled and now have become sheep like sheep without a shepherd, and have all went astray, turned to our own way, And so the Lord has chose to punish him for the iniquity of us all. And we see that, of course, this is the idea behind the new covenant, is that God is going to transform the hearts of his own covenant people, Israel, and by virtue of that, use them as a faithful witness to the nations, such that he is going to call out from amongst them a people who will also come to worship him and become a part of this renewed Israel on equal footing with the ethnic descendants of Abraham through Jacob, in such a way that now all of the distinctions that separate them are going to become irrelevant as they become united, while they remain diversified as a grouping of nations becoming one nation. That being said, the idea here in Mark 14, finishing out the Passover Seder and the Lord's Supper, is that the new covenant is actually being fulfilled as Jesus is about to offer himself, spill his blood for the sake of the new covenant being enacted. Now, how this connects back to Mark 6 and 8 with respect to the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000, considering the fact that Jesus broke the bread after he blessed it and gave it to his disciples, and then they disseminated it to the crowds. They first disseminated it to their own countrymen because they were the ones fed first, and then they'll disseminate it to the nations afterward. Jesus then will take the bread in Mark 14 and make this an image of his body, but yet again giving it to his disciples. And in the immediate sense, they consume it. But what is the idea of Mark 6 and 8? That they are supposed to take his body and take the blood of the new covenant and give it to the nations. They will carry it to their own first. You will be witnesses of me here in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Then you will take it to the nations. That is the idea. So we'll finish here. As I had drawn out the concept earlier from Mark 6, I'm repeating it now by reciting these passages, that after he gets into the boat and the wind dies down, they're completely astounded. It's because they don't understand the loaves. And they don't understand the loaves because their hearts were hardened. Now let's go over here and see what's going on in Mark chapter 8, because there's more to this. So then they're going to be getting on a boat yet again, and they realize they haven't packed bread. So they start to kind of whisper and murmur to each other that they've forgotten bread, and maybe asking, what are they going to do? So then Jesus also will ask or make the statement, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And they start to conflate that with what they were just talking about. The idea of, okay, what does he mean by that? Are we in trouble because we've forgotten bread? And so and Jesus says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand? Don't you comprehend? Or do you have hardened hearts? Which would also go on to mean eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear. And that is an expression that comes to us discreetly, but directly from Isaiah. That is coupled with his commission to go and preach to the people of Jerusalem and Judea, or Judah. And he asks how long? And the Lord says, till everything lies in ruins, so that hearing they may not hear, and seeing they may not see. And so many times throughout the oracles of Isaiah, there is talk about this people being blind and deaf, but also the promise that God is going to open their eyes and unstop their ears so they can see and hear and finally respond with a faithful heart that he himself has renewed and transformed. So Jesus is talking to them and asking them, are you like your ancestors, those that were spoken to and about by Isaiah, who do not hear or see? You have seen and heard. You know the truth. So do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets did you collect? 12. They told him. What about the 7 loaves for the 4,000? How many baskets? 7. And he said to them, do you not understand yet? Now, you might be thinking, well, one takeaway from that would be that Jesus is saying, do you not realize I could take a morsel of bread and turn it into a mountain of loaves? I could make bread come out of thin air. You're worried because you don't have bread, when I can do something about that, and above and beyond your wildest expectations, as I've proven that twice over already. Sure, I don't think that that's outside of the bounds of what this means, but we have to go back here to Mark 6, because he is connecting all this for us, and understand how this also factors into the moment where, when they see Jesus calm down the raging wind and waves, they're astounded but they don't yet quite understand the significance of the loaves and the feeding of the 5,000. And that is more than just the idea that Jesus can make bread come out of nothing. You might say, well, yeah, because he's God. He can create bread from nothing, or take a few loaves and turn it into all this bread, as he rained bread from heaven before. Yes, in fact, John will make a connection along those lines, when in his gospel, we're going to see people following Jesus and then saying, give us more bread, like Moses gave our ancestors bread from heaven. So yeah, all those connections are being made with the idea of God doing this very thing to meet the need and want of his people. Sure. But it's more than that. It's more than that in the sense that this is the response on the part of the disciples. And Mark wants us to make sure that we get this. Why are their hearts hardened? To have a hardened heart is to see and yet to choose not to respond, or respond in the way that one should. In spite of the evidences, you're still going to go about it the way that you think is best. And of course, that's going to lead to the end of destruction. Now, trying to factor that into this particular moment here is not to say that these disciples are going to choose to do something different from what Jesus is doing. But to say their hearts are hardened is to say that there's clear evidence in front of their faces, and they're not responding or not accepting it in the way that they should. And that evidence is pointing to more than just the fact that he's God incarnated in human flesh, which I'm not exactly sure the disciples were meant to think that at that particular moment, but instead to see very clearly what is happening with respect to the one that Isaiah said was going to come has not only come, but is doing everything that Isaiah said would happen. And it's happening in a way that they never thought it would. What does that look like? It looks like the feast of heaven and the very kingdom itself, or I should say the feast of the kingdom and heaven and earth joining together, have now happened. And is about to happen again with feeding of 4,000. And once that has happened, Jesus is saying to them, be weary of the leaven of the Pharisees. What does that mean? The sinful influence and indoctrination of the Pharisees, which for the many things that they would purport, seems to suggest you have to become pure of heart before Messiah will come, and the kingdom then will come once Messiah has come. Messiah is already here, and it had nothing to do with the purity of the hearts of the people of Israel. Do not listen to the Pharisees, who are touting the idea that the nations are going to be reduced to rubble, and that Israel is going to be exalted above all the nations and rule at large over them, because that is not what the Old Testament, especially the prophets like Isaiah, are teaching. Instead, the nations are going to be gathered in. So do not listen to what they say, as goes the very thing that could harden your heart against God's agenda as exercised through Messiah. Instead, get on board with it. Get on board with it. What happened on the sea was a moment of testing for them so that they would understand who they are following and what his agenda is, such that when they get over to the other side, the region of Gennesaret and the Decapolis, where the Gentiles abound, that they understand Messiah has got something in store for everyone, including them. And they have a mission and a mandate to fulfill after he leaves, which will see them going out to these peoples whose doors they would never darken, whose houses they would never venture into, whose property they would never step onto had it not been for the direct express command of their Messiah. Go. And so that would be a takeaway for us. We understand we have a mandate to the nations. We are part of the nations that were brought into this renewed Israel that is now becoming one body with them. Yes. But we still suffer at times from our own hardness of heart, and recognizing that our agenda sometimes doesn't match up with Messiah's agenda. We're too busy about the temporal nature of our lives and our own kingdoms that we're building, rather than attempting to try to see his manifested in our hearts, watching him build his kingdom and wanting to be a part of that. That we'll get too easily sidetracked, and instead our hearts will become hardened with the idea that we were made to be new creatures, part of a new humanity, a new creation with a purpose in them, which is not a part-time gig. It is not the thing that we take up as a hobby and do on the side when we have time to spare, like we would building model train sets or something. No. This is the job. This is why we're here. Everything else is ancillary and something of a hobby in comparison to it. So I hope that makes sense. And I always draw it back to the idea of our job is to go. But friends, this is the only job that's been given to the church. Never will you hear me say, go join a program within the church or find some place of ministry that you can participate in. I'm not saying those are bad things, but you shouldn't do that. Yes. But never let that be the thing that you find your escape into, such that you feel you can do that and forego the one mission that God has given every member of his church, his renewed Israel, because we still have the mandate to go and preach the gospel, as Mark is saying in his version of the Great Commission, to every creature under heaven. So let that fill your minds and hearts today. Father, we thank you. Lord, help us. You are so patient, loving, and kind to us. Help us to see, to hear, strip away from us every sense of hardness of heart. Help us to follow you, as you deserve every ounce of loyalty and obedience that we can give. And in your holy, blessed name, I pray. Thanks for listening.